Fighters scramble, armed with atomic weapons, ready to wage the last war on Earth. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, mankind came closer than ever to wiping itself off the planet. And the world watched and held its breath.
We start flying over Cuba because there's all kinds of reports of what the Soviets were doing there.
A right-wing dictator friendly to the U.S. had been ousted by a left-wing dictator friendly to the Soviets. Fidel Castro, Khrushchev's man, in Havana. On October 15th, 1962, U-2 photos from Cuba kept Pentagon analysts up all night.
Что если бы мы также поставили ракеты с атомными зарядами, значит, но скрытно, чтобы Соединенные Штаты не знали, потому что если бросить на Нью-Йорк.
We had many thousands of nuclear weapons that we could deliver against the Soviet Union in a matter of minutes to hours. The Soviets had far fewer weapons that they could have delivered against the United States. That's one of the reasons they were installing weapons in Cuba, to try to close this gap.
I approached Khrushchev and said, look, I think this is very risky because the Americans will react very strongly. And he said, well, we aren't doing anything besides what the Americans have been doing for several years now. They have their missiles around us, so we will just equate them in a way.
John F. Kennedy was stunned. In days, the missiles could be launched. In minutes, 17 million Americans could be wiped out. By October 22nd, reporters knew something was up. Kennedy had to break the bad news.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
Kennedy announced all Soviet ships bound for Cuba would be stopped and searched for weapons. Any ship that refused would be sunk.
Speed 600 plus. 5 unknown. Kilo Zulu, Whiskey 4.
For the first time ever, the president invoked Pentagon procedures to prepare for nuclear war.
We can't be certain.
They're called defense condition levels. The lowest level is 5, the highest level is 1. And during a crisis where it was considered that there was a risk, a danger of nuclear war, the level would be increased.
55 degrees. Altitude unknown.
Kennedy moved from Defense Condition 5 to DEFCON 2. B-52s, carrying nuclear weapons, flew to staging points outside the Soviet Union. Each pilot carried more firepower than all the Allied bombers in World War II. To protect its fighters, the Air Force dispersed them to remote airfields, like Volk in northern Wisconsin, so small it didn't even have a control tower. Volk's command post was a base in Duluth, Minnesota. Duluth would tell them if the missile crisis reached the flashpoint. And on the chilly night of October 25th, it did. A saboteur is infiltrating the Duluth base.
Stop! Who goes there?
The sentry's challenge goes unanswered.
Stop or shoot! It's North 7, come in, over.
This was it.
I got people climbing the fence out here and shots have been fired, sir. Over.
The Russians were coming. 300 miles away at Volk Field, fighter pilots awoke to the sound of nuclear war.
And that was a real rude awakening, to say the least, because we had been told that there wouldn't be any practices. It was real serious if we were going to launch there in the dark of night with nukes on board.
Back in Duluth, the sentry closed in on his saboteur. At Volk Field, the duty officer discovered the false alarm, but he couldn't call back the fighters. Volk didn't have a control tower. At the last second, truck headlights suddenly appeared on the runway. It was the quick-thinking duty officer.
Normally you're always eager to go, but in that particular case, I wasn't bothered by the fact that we turned around and came back.
A nuclear launch was averted in the nick of time, but it wasn't the last heart-stopping blunder of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world...
On October 26, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis reached its 11th day, and the world still held its breath. Around the globe, people were stocking up for doomsday. The Soviet people were never warned that each minute might be their last, but a few figured it out.
I spent the whole time at the command post, but I called home. And I told my wife, why don't you go and visit my mother in the Ivanova region? And you can imagine, I couldn't be too forthright over the phone, but she understood it, and she said, no, we'll stay here.
In Washington, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was preparing to invade Cuba. He estimated 18,000 men could be wounded or killed. To save American lives, some of Kennedy's advisors proposed destroying the missiles with a so-called surgical strike. The meeting was secretly recorded. The tapes were released only in 1996.
If we go in and take them out of a quick airstrike, there's bound to be a reprisal from the Soviet Union. There always is, which leaves the only one alternative, which is fire nuclear weapons, which is a hell of an alternative.
In the nuclear age, the deterrent to a surprise attack is the threat of a counterattack. But to counterattack, you need a warning of incoming warheads.
Warning time is critical. It gives you time to get your airplanes off and to kill the other guy before he does too much damage. He may get that first one off, but what he causes is a retaliatory strike that is going to be decisive.
Normally, the Pentagon would have 30 minutes warning, but now, Soviet missiles were just 90 miles from Key West. On October 26th, a radar station in Moorestown, New Jersey, was scanning the skies above Cuba.
Major, I think you better take a look at this.
Suddenly, Moorestown picked up a missile.
What you got?
It looked like the first shot of World War III. Before the Cuban Missile Crisis, U.S. radar was aimed only over the North Pole, toward Russia.
Even though Cuba was there, we didn't consider it a significant threat, and certainly not a missile threat. And when this occurred, that changed very quickly.
The Air Force took over radar sites used for tracking satellites and pointed them at Cuba. One site was Moorestown, New Jersey. If a missile were launched from Cuba, it would be detected here first. So vital was Moorestown that the Air Force installed a hotline straight to the White House. For technicians who tracked harmless satellites, the hotline was nerve-wracking.
We certainly did not want to, or nor should we, be talking directly to the White House. And we immediately notified our command that someone had ordered a phone directly to the White House, and that's not the way the system normally was established.
The hotline was removed, but at Moorestown, the heat was on.
If that missile is going to Washington from Cuba, it's probably about 10 minutes before it impacts. So now you have 10 minutes in Washington to say Hail Mary or Our Father, you know, because that's not an awful lot of time.
Time was crucial. Kennedy would have just minutes to decide whether to destroy the Soviet Union. The computer needed 30 seconds just to calculate the missile's target.
30 seconds in this case seems an awful long time.
At last, its course was clear. It was heading out to sea. The missile was fired from Patrick Air Force Base in Florida. In the middle of the highest alert in American history, the Air Force was conducting a routine test. It hadn't even warned Moorestown.
As a result of this event, that was corrected and corrected very quickly.
But Moorestown wasn't the only station watching the skies.
That launch could easily have been monitored by the Soviet Union and could have been interpreted as the leading edge of a sudden U.S. nuclear attack.
We were at standby in full combat readiness. There were moments when we really felt, if needed, we would go in a second.
If the Titan missile had looked to the Soviets like a sneak attack, nuclear war could have begun on October 26, 1962.
Everyone knew that we were playing nuclear roulette with one another, that when you have thousands of nuclear weapons on hair-trigger alert, even on a daily basis, much less during a crisis, that something could happen.
As the Titan disappeared into the Atlantic, 5,000 miles away in the Arctic, another crisis was brewing. Early on October 27, 1962, Chuck Maltzby took off from Alaska on a routine mission to sample the air near Russia for signs of atomic tests. At that very moment, the superpowers were locked in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the gravest threat to mankind since World War II. Yet no one had thought to cancel Maltzby's flight.
History produces revelations every year about the Cuban Missile Crisis and other nuclear crises that indicate that our national political authorities never understood fully what was happening in the field, what our nuclear forces were doing, and what the risks were that those forces might be used without their permission.
Maltzby was flying over the North Pole, where his magnetic compass was useless. Instead, he had to navigate as Columbus did, using a sextant to read the stars. Unexpectedly, the northern lights began to shimmer, and the stars vanished. Then his transmissions to base started to break up.
Saber 1 to Lions Den, over.
They kind of cut in and cut out.
Saber 1 to Lions Den.
And it was difficult sometimes to find out exactly what he was saying. But there was cause for alarm because he was well overdue on the time that he should have been back over Alaskan airspace.
Maltby searched for American frequencies to guide him home. Alone, above the Arctic Circle, Chuck Maltby was lost.
The first word I had that anything was wrong was a sideband radio message from Chuck saying I should have picked up some navigation frequencies long ago and I can't find them. I need some help.
Moments later, Maltby's radio crackled to life. The broadcast was Russian. By now, Maltby's base had lost him.
Well, we got one.
But in Kotzebue, Alaska, the world's most powerful radar was tracking him. Chuck Maltby had taken a wrong turn. He was in the USSR. The Air Force couldn't help him without disclosing its top-secret radar. All they could do was pray. At Maltby's base, Don Webster decided to send out a search party. Two hours later, they hadn't found Maltby. They were low on fuel, and they were heading home toward the rising sun.
For some reason, it just triggered my thoughts to call Chuck and ask him if he could see the sun. And when he replied that he could not, I knew immediately that he was way too far west. So I told him immediately turn 90 degrees to the left. I said, "Do you see the sun now?" And he said, "Yes, I see it right on the nose of the aircraft." And I said, "Don't turn."
But Maltby's trouble was just beginning.
Воздух, квадрат 41, 47, самолет.
See, in this kind of a situation, when you are very nervous, you see this target and then you question yourself whether to shoot them down or not. And at the same time, you have to consider that you can provoke quite a conflict by doing that. So notwithstanding all these facts, that the people were tired and their nerves exhausted, our task was to reach this target and to shoot it down.
Scramble, scramble, Alpha Papa 60 and 61.
At the 317th Fighter Squadron, Joe Rogers launched two interceptors to the rescue.
We knew he was being pursued. We knew they were trying to get him.
The fighters were armed with air-to-air nukes to shoot down enemy planes.
Once you assume alert status, everything is in readiness to be fired. All the missiles are plugged in and ready to go. The crews realize that they have a major responsibility with that thing they're carrying in the belly, and there's nobody to stop them from using it.
In the Arctic skies, the superpowers steered a collision course to nuclear war. As Maltby's U-2 raced towards safety, Major Rudy Anderson was piloting another U-2 over Cuba. The Soviets spotted him at high noon.
It was just a mistake that was made in a weird situation. A lieutenant general saw the plane and didn't know what to do, so he gave an order to shoot it down. And when they did, Moscow was shocked.
The Pentagon urged President Kennedy to retaliate.
Robert Kennedy came to me. He said, "Mr. Bitzer, the president just received information that the Cubans shot down our reconnaissance plane. Our generals demand to return fire for fire. We have many planes, fighters, and they could really knock out all these missiles.
Invasion was the only answer for the Air Force Chief of Staff, the same man who urged two other presidents to drop the bomb, Curtis LeMay. As tempers flared in the White House Situation Room, LeMay compared Kennedy's hesitation to Britain's reluctance to stop Hitler.
This is almost as bad as achievement of nukes, but I just don't see any other solution except direct military intervention right now.
LeMay didn't know what was waiting for him. 40,000 Soviet troops and 42 tactical nukes for use right on the beach. By now, both the Soviets and the Cubans were convinced the Americans were about to attack. If they did, Castro demanded his comrades retaliate with everything they had. The Soviet ambassador to Havana was so nervous, he spent the entire crisis in his bomb shelter. The choice between peace and war rested on the shoulders of John Kennedy. 12 miles above Siberia, Chuck Maltzby was still racing for home. Suddenly, his lone blip was joined by two others, but the Soviets didn't know if they were watching a rescue or an attack.
We could see the whole situation on the board. The phones were ringing constantly, and our commanders were asking questions non-stop. Why is he still there? Why is he still in there? And we had to take him out.
Over the Bering Strait, Maltzby finally met his rescuers. The Soviets turned back.
Good thing they never met. The way it happened, the American aircraft managed to flee before the Soviet planes reached this place. The planes that came to help Maltzby had nuclear missiles on board, and that could have been quite an incident if anything happened. When McNamara found out that Americans were there, he was pulling his hair out, shouting, "What are you doing? It means war with the Soviet Union."
Just as he ran out of fuel, Maltzby glided in. When Kennedy found out what happened, he reportedly said, "There's always some son of a bitch who doesn't get the word." Kennedy chose not to retaliate for the death of Rudy Anderson. 36 hours later, Khrushchev agreed to remove his missiles from Cuba. Kennedy agreed not to invade Cuba and to secretly remove his own missiles in Turkey. The 13-day crisis was over.
During that 1 week, I lost something like 3 kilos. And when I told that to my wife, she said, "Couldn't you find a safer way to reduce?"
Был не Кеннеди, а кто-нибудь вот с таким характером, каким обладал.
It's hard to say what the result would have been if there hadn't been somebody like Kennedy on the other side, but somebody just like our Khrushchev.
Вы хотите ядерной войны?
He said, "You want nuclear war, you'll get it."
Кеннеди был до непредсказуемых совершений.
Kennedy was a very balanced and calm man, and he managed to suppress the fire that could burn the whole thing down.
But even Kennedy lacked all the facts. For once, the U.S. was better off in the dark.
They geared up for war, and we missed it. Our intelligence apparatus didn't detect nearly anything that the Russians were up to during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Had we detected those activities, it would have been fuel for the fire. It could have pushed things to the brink, if not over the brink.